Jesus said, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So the man went and did just that. I hope he was all right. He had suffered so much, and some of it had been at the hands of his neighbors, his community. Even though they would probably say it was for his own good, and certainly for their own safety, they were the ones who had kept him under guard, bound him in chains and shackles over and over again. And now he had to go back to his old place with his life made new, to share what God had done for him, despite his longing to turn the page completely and move on with Jesus to a new place. But Jesus asks him to return to his home and to his past transformed, in order to transform everything there. I hope he was all right. I hope his neighbors could find it in their hearts to see him as he now was, to hear what he had to say, to receive the gift he came to bring them. As we reflect on the good news in this very disturbing story, surely it's one of the scariest stories in the Gospels, I want us to think about what it means to live in an old place in a new way, and by doing so, transform both our past and our future. Because both the healed man and the community he returned to had to do that. They had to learn to look at their shared past from a new vantage point, a much more generous place, a very unexpected place. And they had to learn to tell a new story together about their future, a new story about someone they had feared, a new story about his place in their community and their ability to include him, a new story about the healing grace of God that had made these things possible. But what if the people in the city of the Gerasenes had refused to do that? What if they had closed their eyes to grace, turned their backs on mercy, and refused to consider a new story? It's a terrible thought, but it was a very real risk. I want to explore that what if question and look at the potential for just such a refusal happening in our own times. So let's start small and personal. A couple of weeks ago, I was riding the number 27 bus up the hill to the Cathedral. A man got on, disheveled and shabby, and walked up and down the bus speaking about his vision of love between all people, telling us how God had brought him to that understanding. He wasn't very coherent. He was certainly very passionate. He repeated himself very often. But he was joyful and earnest and insistent that he needed to share this story with all of us. Those on the bus kind of looked away. Some of us sighed. We all waited to see what would happen next. And eventually the bus driver said, "Sir, we have to keep this bus moving. You need either to sit down or get off." And so he got off, and the bus drove on, which of course it needed to do. But I wondered what we had lost in that moment. What new story of grace had not been heard? What kind of a story were we telling ourselves about that man at the same time that he was trying to tell us how much God had done for him? Expanding the scale from this single experience, to a defining period in our shared history. In this Pride Month, I remember what it was like to serve on the Cathedral staff in the 1980s. I remember with pain the experience of our LGBTQ friends who were never able to return home because it was too dangerous, and the people there were just not willing to let them back in. I remember all the people who fled to San Francisco and built lives of love and care in this city, who found community and hope and a new story for their lives in this cathedral, and who died here, far from their old homes. I remember the anguish of the parents who felt they couldn't take their child's ashes home, who chose to leave their child in our columbarium because they knew they had felt safe in this place, because they could never talk about them or how much God had done for them back home. And I see with foreboding the growing threat that the attitude that caused this pain is coming back. Or maybe it's just re-emerging from our collective shadows where it's been hiding out. I see the increasing refusal by some to acknowledge that coming out as gay, as queer, most especially right now as trans, is a good thing, a direct result of God's radical acceptance and love. And I see that refusal spreading to exclude not just LGBTQ people, but immigrants and migrants, people of color, people without homes, people with disabilities, anyone really who seems different in some way, and therefore, according to some stories, threatening. It seems a long way from my brief encounter with that man on the bus to the public issues that preoccupy and terrify us in these days, especially on this day when warfare threatens. But the things we are afraid of are deeply connected to the stories we are willing or unwilling to tell ourselves collectively. Stories about who we are, about who our neighbors are, about our history and our assumptions, about the people we have bound in chains in the past, about who is included and who is not. So our gospel today challenges us to embrace a counter-narrative to the dark stories that increasingly surround us, stories that have the potential to refuse God's grace. We're challenged to look at who we are becoming together as individual Christians and communities in relation to people who have suffered and who are seeking healing and welcome. People who are or have been homeless or mentally ill, imprisoned or immigrants, people who are queer or poor, people we have shunned and ignored or even persecuted for being different. Are we willing to welcome them home? Will we be open and humble enough to change our story in order to accept the gifts that they bring to us with their stories of struggle and grace? Can we do this even if they don't look quite respectable yet, if they don't conform to our norms for behavior, if they seem in any way strange to us? Will we put them under guard, bind them in chains and shackles? Will we place them in danger and do them harm? Or will we find ways to celebrate how much God has done for them? On an even larger national scale, our gospel asks still harder questions. Will we do the painful collective work of returning to our past, unpicking the threads of racism and exclusion that are woven into our history in this country? Will we look honestly at the fear and prejudice that have been embedded in our national psyche since the founding of our nation and which bind us to this day? Will we renounce these things and find ways to tell a new story about who we are as Americans? It's clear that many who currently lead our nation have a very different story to tell. A story in which anyone who is different is going to just disappear through arrest and summary deportation, through ejection from the military or the public offices they have faithfully served, or the universities in which they have taught, by having their social security identities removed or their health care taken away, by taking the names of historical heroes and leaders off our public monuments and military installations, by purging unacceptable names and identities and topics from public websites, by creating lists of people and nations who are excluded. It's all happening. And this week we have all seen how this story can lead not only to hatred, but to violence. Violence against migrants, violence against protesters, violence against our elected officials, ill-considered and ominous military violence. This is a very dangerous story indeed, and it is completely contrary to the gospel. Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you, says Jesus, as he reunites the healed man with the community that has excluded him. And he says the same thing to us. Like that man, all of us have a story of God's love to tell, because Jesus lived and died and rose again for all of us, because he overcame the powers of death and hell for us all. Jesus asks every person he has touched with his redeeming love to tell our story. He asks it of every person striving to build godly communities of trust and love, everyone who is looking for the new story that God is calling us to tell and to live together. This, my friends, is the moment when Christians need to bring forward and proclaim unashamedly the counter-narrative of God's love and justice and mercy towards all people that we find in the gospel of Jesus Christ and that we have experienced in our own lives. My friend Paul Bayes, the retired Bishop of Liverpool, gave this warning in an article last week. He said, "Not to imagine God's future is to cede it to those who imagine a lesser thing." Not to imagine God's future is to cede it to those who imagine a lesser thing. And Walter Brueggemann, the eminent theologian who died recently, wrote, "The prophetic tasks of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, grieve in a society that practices denial, and express hope in a society that lives in despair." It's our job as Christians to seek the grace that will enable us to imagine God's future and do the prophetic things that will help make that future real. It's our vocation to immerse our imaginations in the new story that God is telling, and then to proclaim it, like the man in the gospel, especially at a time when so many are eager to imagine a future based on lesser things. We are called to imagine and then proclaim a different view of humanity, a different understanding of truth and justice and care, a different vision of community, to imagine the kind of healing after conflict in which all parties are restored to each other in community. And we're called to act in order to make God's new story real, visible, and possible. We've been practicing as people of faith for this moment for a long time. We anticipate God's future here in this cathedral every Sunday, where we gather to immerse ourselves in God's story, which is always new, and to receive God's mercy and grace one more time. Where we gather round this table at which all are welcome and all are fed. Where God's love for us is placed into our hands, reinscribed in our minds and hearts. And now we are being sent out once more to proclaim this new story, to make God's counter-narrative real in a world that needs it so badly. Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you.